Yes. Welcome to the second panel. I'm going to read you the question that has been set to our distinguished panel, partly because I need to read it myself again to understand it. The crisis in the EU and the future of integration. Is Multispeed Europe the only way forward for enlargement? So while you think about that, I will introduce myself. I'm Tim Judah. I'm the Balkans correspondent of The Economist, and we've got a distinguished panel who are going to discuss this question. But I thought I would start by just reading you the latest from Mrs. Merkel. We need more Europe. We don't only need monetary union, we also need a so-called fiscal union, and most of all, we need a political union, which means we need to generally cede powers to the EU and give Europe control. And she also said, we cannot stop the process because one or other does not want to join in yet. Well, I can think of some countries, my own, the top of the list, who would certainly disagree with that. So clearly, there is, I mean, Multispeed Europe obviously already exists to a certain extent, but clearly we're going to move it, well, clearly we are discussing a different form of Europe in the years to come. But what sort of Europe that's going to be is, of course, anybody's guess. But I hope that everybody on the panel will do some guessing. I'd just like to, before I hand it over to our panelists, I would just like to say that reflecting on what was a little bit discussed in the last panel, which could have been, some of the discussion could have been summed up in the question, has the Balkans become boring yet? And the answer would be, yes, it's become so boring that we're now complaining that we're not on the front pages of the newspapers, etc. And then, as Vesna Pusic said, this is what she had dreamed of 10 years ago, that Croatia and the Balkans would be off the international news agenda. And of course, that's generally a good thing. But what I think that no one could have imagined 10 years ago is, of course, that the Balkans have become the boring and actually quite stable part of Europe, whereas all around it, everything is changing. Only 100 miles from here, of course, somebody actually used, for the first time, I'd never heard this before, but actually used the word failed state, talking about Greece earlier on. I don't know if we're there yet, but it's interesting that that was an expression that was used. And of course, everywhere else, I don't think anyone needs reminding, is the turmoil of the Eurozone. So now, recently we had an election in Serbia, somebody from a former extreme nationalist won the presidency, and, well, is there a crisis? Well, no, there isn't really a crisis. It's actually quite boring. And Serbia will probably be pretty much the same place tomorrow as it was yesterday. So can you connect all these thoughts? That's my question for my panel. What does the debates, what does the problems of Europe today mean for European integration and mean for the future? So the first panelist is Tuta Arifi. She's Deputy Prime Minister for European Affairs from Macedonia. Mrs. Arifi, you're on the front line. You're the person who goes to Brussels, you're the person who speaks to people, and so you're the person, I think, who is probably best placed to tell us, what does the changes around Europe mean for Macedonia and for the Western Balkans and for integration? And is this debate about multi-speed Europe, is it relevant for Macedonia and for the region? What are you understanding from what people are saying to you?
Thank you very much. I think that we can go on to discuss the European idea if we go on from the discussion of the first session. The session where 20 years ago, I think that being a part of one region, which has been a region with a lot of conflicts, a common Europe has been seen as a way forward for the stability, for the economic better development of the region, and in general a kind of secure future for one region in the conflict. Today, from the perspective of 20 years after, being and sitting in the position of the Vice Prime Minister for European Affairs, in one country which is characteristic for the multi-ethnic democracy, known for all priorities and fragilities which each multi-ethnic democracy brings, sometimes you have to answer to not only difficult questions in Brussels, but quite in a lot difficult questions at home, in a way to keep a Euro enthusiasm when sometimes it may come under the question for different reasons. Actually, my approach, it is that Europe and the common Europe, when it was formed, as you have been saying, it was not meant to be a union who will fail in front of the first strong and serious financial crisis it may face. I think that European Union, as a strong political concept, was formed not only to prevail, but to be more stronger after such kind of crisis. And this is not an answer of one Euro-enthusiastic politician or former member of civil society who still keeps this dynamic in her political life, but it is a strong trust in the values that are important to be given to our process. So that actually, for me, it was very crucial that in a process with European Union, when I took the portfolio, for example, we had a situation of very low dynamics in relation of the processes with European Union. With high-level accession dialogue, a process which started in March of this year, I think that we breached a main problem that we have for time as a country concerning the name issue, in order to put our accent in the questions which are important in the approaching process to Europe, and this is freedom of media, freedom of expression, the question of reforms in the judiciary, the questions of interethnic relations and democracy, the questions of economic criteria as very important moments that we have to work on, and normally not forgetting that the main and big political issue concerning the name has to be resolved in one stage. I would like to say here in this very, very short answer to your question that European agenda and European concept, it is important to be present in our societies and in our politics, because the European Union, it is a strong instrument to go forward with the democratic processes in our countries. And in this stage where, as it was mentioned before, not speaking just on stability, but as well on democracy anymore in our states and in our societies, I think that European Union, it is a very important partner, not to use the word tool, but important inspiration for this process to go forward, and I try to make a maximum, normally, use of this concept. Thank you.
Thank you. But before I go on to you, Dusan Relic, I'm just going to ask you one quick question. You said something interesting there, that as far as I understood it, in the past it was always answering questions from Brussels, but now is it more and more answering questions domestically, people saying, if this whole thing is such a mess, why are we trying to join it? Is that what people are asking you?
Sometimes you can get such kind of questions, and my answer, it is every time the answer that I mentioned, that we have to participate in a process of strengthening of European Union if normally we want to be an equal part of one process. If we remain in a position of the passivity that something, somewhere, institution in Brussels has to give us the way and the orders how to move, I think that our societies and our democracies, after 20 years, they are more matured, and I think that they can take more ownership to the process. It is not easy thing. It is not easy when within your society and within your political life you have to debate very much and very tough issues sometimes, but I think that European concept and Europe is worthy for that political, strong and tough debate at home.
All right, well, we'll come back to asking you the difficult questions about Multispeed Europe later. Dusan Relic, you're Senior Research Associate at the German Institute from International and Security Affairs. Well, to paraphrase Mr. Bildt and Eurovision earlier on, well, come in Berlin.
Well, the previous session consisted of 4 optimists and 1 realist. But there was one issue on which they agreed, and this is EU has no alternative. Okay, fair enough, but this sounds a little bit like a truism by now. Also, we have in the title of our debate whether we are going to experience a multi-speed Europe. What I'm going to propose for a discussion is also a multi-directional Europe. And to make it more concrete, and I'm talking about a scenario, I'm not prophesizing, the crystal ball is not yet part of the office equipment, even at the German Institute for International Affairs and Security. What I'm sort of sketching is a future for Southeast Europe, which is a little bit less Euro-Atlantic and a little bit more Euro-Asian. And why this could develop, I'd like to point out in 2 or 3 minutes. First of all, in the region of former Yugoslavia, we have now, since the 1980s, already the 2nd generation of people maturing with depressing economic and life perspectives. We have adolescents growing up presently in no better economic or social conditions than their parents had, and definitely in worse conditions than their grandparents. And I think that the research that Srđan Bogosavljević is going to present to you tomorrow, I think, is going to illustrate this point that I just made. Since 2009, we have seen very little or no economic growth at all in this region. The 6 Southeast European countries in the reports of the World Bank have the highest unemployment and poverty rates in Europe. The poverty reduction gains from pre-crisis times have been lost in the meanwhile and are reversed. The middle class is becoming more vulnerable. Unemployment in Serbia is equal to the unemployment in Spain, meaning 24% and 50% for the young generation, which is higher than in Greece, which someone called previously a failed state. We have 40% children in Macedonia growing up in poverty, and we have 15% pregnant women in Kosovo underweight. These are all UN data. So I think that the people in the situation are fully all right when they feel fear, when they are not sure what the future is going to bring them. And this reminds the people of the 80s and the 90s, the times of the wars and the conflicts. So what is being told to the Southeast European 6 countries, which is minus Croatia, what used to be called the Western Balkans, is that they should hope to catch the so-called convergence train, which is if they become members of the European Union, they might stand a chance to bridge the capital income gap with developed or core EU countries. So once they enter the EU, there will be a shower of money, perhaps billions, and they might join this convergence train. But the EU, at this very moment, is a source of risks for the economies of the country. It's not any longer only a chance. I'm sure that Lazar Kekic and Vladimir Gligorov in their presentations will provide a far better analysis, but just look at trade, foreign direct investments. Gligorov's institute just yesterday said that this year the foreign direct investments in the Balkan region is going to fall by 7%, and it's already very low. The banks are in foreign hands, in the hands of countries which are quite imperiled by the Eurozone crisis, and the remittances of the migrant workers are going back. So I really don't see at the moment that anyone can claim with reasonable arguments that the EU is providing a chance at this very moment for the people. It might be in the future. At the moment, it's a source of risks. But the risks are not only economic, they're also political. Because as Dmitry Bechev in one of his recent papers on the EU and its influence in the neighborhood wrote, the EU exhibits also certain features of a hegemonic power in relations to the enlargement countries. It simply tells them, if you want to become member of the club, you have to change your identities. You have to give up things which are very dear to you. Kosovo to Serbia, for instance, or to Macedonia, no matter what the private opinions of various ministers are, the point which is being told again and again to Macedonia is that as long as Greece is preventing them, they have to do something about their identity. Then they might join the EU, not before. Or some Albanians have been dreaming for a long, long time about creating a greater state. But we just heard Minister Bildt saying, no more border changes in the region. We don't want to accept this. History, I think, teaches us that if nations decide to change borders, they do it. This is history in the last 150 years in Europe or so. But we'll see, of course, about this. What the Western Balkans, I think, in the eyes of most of the people in the Balkans needs, absolutely needs, is economic growth, capital to grow. And capital to the Balkans at the moment is not coming from the Greece, which holds 20% of the bank assets in Serbia. It's not coming from Germany. It's not coming from France, which is also very strong in bank terms, neither from Italy. So if the governments want to be re-elected in the region, they have to look for sources of capital. And where is capital available at this moment? For some reason, the Prime Minister of Macedonia has seen the Chinese Prime Minister 3 times in 2 years. And a lot of people go to Turkey, even to Azerbaijan, to ask for capital. They hope that Russia will not stop only in the energy sector, but it will continue investing in the transport, in communications, in banking system, and so on and so on. Especially because these are investments, this is a capital inflow which is imminent. It's not about waiting for 10 or 15 years to become members of the European Union. So what do we do in the meanwhile? In the meanwhile, Multispeed Europe, elements of it exist already for the Western Balkans, for the enlargement countries. These are the so-called sectoral integration instruments, like the aviation community, like the energy community, like the up to now not realized transport community. So probably a way for the European Union to sustain influence and political leverage in the region and to keep up the good spirits in the region and the hope that they might join the convergence train is to export more and more of the acquis to the region, like through the energy community, like through the aviation community, to have sectoral integration, which is very important, justice and home affairs. But I think the point which is of utmost importance for the region, and sorry, I'll finish in a minute, is of course migration, labor migration. Because, just to remind you, Kosovo is the size of 1/3 of Belgium. It has 30,000 people coming on the labor market every year. It has approximately 500,000 of unemployed people. So in history, 19th century, the Irish, the Scottish emigrated to Canada, to the US, and so on, and started a new life. People in the Western Balkans cannot emigrate. So I think one has to be very realistic. If you want to stabilize the region, if you want to have growth, first thing you should do, I'm quoting the World Bank, is permit labor migration, start qualifying programs for the people from there. So this has been a little bit of a different approach to things and perhaps a little bit scenario making, but I guess that this is what institutes are paid for, to develop alternatives which might not always be so realistic at the first sight. Thanks.
Thank you, and thanks for such some provocative thoughts there. Just as, again, a short question, if before we carry on, if you were the political advisor to Mrs. Arifi, would you just say, look, don't worry about this European integration for now, let's just kind of slow up on that because there's other more important things to do? No, definitely not. As I said, EU has no alternative. It's a truism. The whole region is surrounded by EU countries. So it would really not make sense to try to look to join the Shanghai Treaty Organization or something like this. You have to try to assimilate as much as the Nordic countries or Switzerland or whoever in Europe is not
yet part of the European Union, has been assimilating.
All right, thank you very much. Ivan Vejvoda, Vice President now of Programs for the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Over to you. Would you like a question?
You're
looking at me like you would like a question?
In Sofia, in Belgrade, or in Washington?
I'm sorry?
Over to me in Sofia, in Belgrade, or in Washington?
Well, I mean, I think as the lesson of Eurovision is that as many of the candidates, many of the singers also had kind of, I'd say, kind of almost multiple identities. For example, the candidate from Albania was, of course, from Kosovo. The candidate from Sweden, I think, is an ethnic Berber, if I'm not mistaken. But so I think everyone can have multiple identities. So I think that is open to you as well.
Okay, thank you, Tim. And it's really a pleasure to be both in Sofia and with the eminent colleagues here on the panel. Let me start out with a quote from somebody who lived in a city called Königsberg, that's part of Russia today, called Kaliningrad, and his name was Immanuel Kant. And some of the conversations that we've been having over the years, and we were saying with Gerald, we are meeting less frequently, fewer and far between, that I take as a good sign, actually, because things are going on their way. And Kant, of course, posed this question, what is the Enlightenment? And the answer was starkingly simple and deep. It's the exit from self-inflicted immaturity. Now, of course, the region is not culpable by itself. As it was mentioned, the great powers during the past 2 centuries have had a playing ground on which they exercised that power. But I would say that what happened in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall was self-inflicted. Of course, due to the legacy of communism, the wrong people in the wrong place at the right time, at the wrong time. You know, Milosevic in Belgrade, Tudjman in Zagreb, and you had a kind of perfect storm that occurred. Had we had Stambolic in Belgrade or Mika Tripalo in Zagreb, I think we would have avoided a war. Maybe not maybe a peaceful velvet divorce like the Czechs and Slovaks had. And so, what I'm saying, it didn't come from the outside. Of course, the whole breakdown was peppered and salted afterwards by many mistakes that the intervention, whether it was diplomatic or military, occurred. So I think that actually, on a positive note, more and more countries and societies in the region are realizing that it is about themselves. As Minister Pusic said this morning, I remember she and I were at a conference 2 years ago in Zagreb where we kind of had the same thought, that it is good for our countries that the rules of the European integration game are being applied more rigorously now, that we do want a stronger rule of law, that we do want the rules of the game to be played for our own sake as citizens of the region, rather to kind of be allowed in with low grades, and then you have the problem of the fatigue that was perceived or misperceived as the wrong time of bringing in a Bulgaria and a Romania. Let me be very clear, I'm very happy that both Romania and Bulgaria are in. When I came to teach at the University of Sussex in southern England in '93, one of the first things I heard from a lot of British colleagues was it was wrong to bring in Greece in 1981. And I said, what are you talking about? I mean, can you imagine, had Greece been outside of the European Union as the country, my former country, and lots of our former country, former Yugoslavia, started to dissolve, what would have been Greece's role in that breakdown? And so, obviously, the whole enlargement process has enormous gaps to fill, but I think, you know, when you have the negative benefit of being the last in the line, you can actually benefit from the lessons of the past. And the lesson of the past is you do have to do the homework before you get in. Now, to your question earlier to my co-panelists, you know, what would be your advice? You know, do you forget this? No, of course you don't, because here we have a rare opportunity where the burden sharing of the difficult reforms, structural reforms, democratic reforms, economic reforms, can be shared with someone called Brussels or the European Union. This is quite unique in history of the whole enlargement process. You can divvy up the hard work and say sometimes that Brussels requires it if you don't want to take all the responsibility for that change. And thus, the Balkans have geographical luck to be on this continent called Europe, where there is this project, ongoing project, of peace after World War II. The problem is, of course, all the generations that Dusan was talking about in Europe have forgotten what the rationale for this project was, because peace is like the air that we breathe. I mean, nobody thinks that there will be war between France and Germany again. I think that's another of the reasons that we all want to join, because we kind of tripped up on the banana in 1989 and kind of did absolutely what we were all taught in school not to do. But because we had an authoritarian system called communism, even in its kind of light totalitarian version that we had in Yugoslavia, it was nonetheless an authoritarian system that did not produce democracy. And so we've had to go the difficult way of building it up ourselves in our individual countries, and of course working together with each other. And I think also one of the things that has happened in these 20 years is that slowly, and to differing degrees, we have overcome this rhetoric of victimhood. You know, poor little us, we didn't do anything, this happened to us because of our neighbors or because of some extraterrestrials, as Carl said. And I think slowly people are realizing that they have to take on the responsibility of the work of change. Now, as I said, it's differing in different countries. I think it's very important that we do not neglect the acquis of democracy that have occurred. It was mentioned by Ivan Krastev today that unfortunately Albania did not get a president today. So this lack of the capacity for compromise is still not existing in some of these countries. But we take it for granted in a country like Serbia because that's where the last elections occurred. By 9:30 in the evening, the loser conceded defeat, congratulated the victor, and we all went home and kind of pondered on what had happened. Now, as you said, nothing dramatic happened. It was a wake-up call in a good sense. Everybody realized that it is about the economy, stupid, and about unemployment. So, Kosovo was not an issue in these elections at all compared to what they were last time. And so the dream that we had back in the early 90s to be boring and discuss the price of butter like one does in Northern Europe is slowly approaching. Now, the problem that we have is, of course, when you're a latecomer, you confront something like the global economic crisis. So you're in extremely adverse conditions. On the positive side, I would say that there is still a repository of resilience in all of these countries, by which I mean that we went through a decade of catastrophe in the 90s that's only 12 years away from us. And so people say, if I lose my job, or if my salary is diminished by 30%, it's still not as bad as bombs falling on my head or people killing each other in the neighboring street or across the borders. Now that repository of resilience is slowly fading away. It won't last very long. I think we're at the very end of it. And if the politicians who are elected and accountable do not seize the moment now to do the hard work of structural reform, of cutting back public spending, of putting the financial house in order, then in some of our countries we might be looking at 4 years down the road a kind of vote that Greece had several weeks ago, and we still don't know how Greece will vote on June 17th. By which I mean that you could be potentially looking at a meltdown situation where, again, Ivan Krastev's word, you could have the casino voter phenomenon with the party that will win hasn't been registered yet. Someone said, and this person is in the room, when I was in Belgrade before the elections, I said, we don't have a Tsar Simeon who will appear, or a Zoran Jankovic, mayor of Ljubljana, who registered his party 2 months ahead of the election. That person said, well, we could have someone, but that person is not stepping forward right now. So, in the volatility of the politics of the situation, I think it's very important to consider the way, and Vesna Pusic mentioned it, it is about leadership in the end. And if we don't have the leaders stepping up to the batting plate, and I'm particularly thinking of my country, Serbia, at this moment in the formation of the government, with a forthright program to come out of this, then obviously it won't bode well, neither for the enlargement process, because, you know, Brussels is, in all of its contorted situation at the moment, trying to save itself, looking for good signals from the region. And again, nobody expects angelic developments. I think what is expected is a clear-cut roadmap of how you will tackle corruption, of how you will engage in diminishing public spending, in how you will actually go ahead and you know, resolve the issue of Kosovo between Belgrade and Pristina. So there's my opening thoughts.
But are you worried that, let us have a benign scenario and the whole region does everything that it's supposed to do, and it gets to the end of this 4-year period and Europe has changed so much that the doors are closed, or not necessarily completely closed, but Lord Owen, who of course was well known in the region, has suddenly reappeared on the media scene in Britain, publishing a book on Europe in which he is positing also some form of multi-speed Europe, in which you have a kind of core Europe, a bit like Mrs. Merkel is talking about, but then you have Turkey and Norway and everybody else in a sort of second-tier kind of European community, free trade zone, etc. And is it possible that we could get to this 4 years and then be told, well, like, you guys can just stay in here with this kind of free trade zone, but forget joining the sort of inner core?
Well, you know, never say never, but I think that, you know, to put a grand statement on it, I think it's about the credibility of Europe. If the 500 million citizens represented by 28 member states are incapable of integrating the remaining 16 million that we are in the Western Balkans after Croatia joins, then what is Europe capable of elsewhere in the world? And I think this promise of membership, you know, the Thessaloniki promise, is something that keeps, you know, politicians with all of their private interests still going towards the public interest of getting these societies in. And again, I would not underestimate the desire to join based on the peace project. Here, that memory of the origin of the European Union is still very much alive, along with what I simply call the realization that as you go in, there's simply that somewhat greater degree of certainty, predictability, and prosperity than if you remain outside, fully realizing the travails that the European Union is in at this moment.
Right, thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Gerald Knaus, who's the chairman of the European Stability Initiative, a think tank which has worked on the region since 1999. Okay, well, over to you. Multispeed Europe, where are we going and how does the region fit into it?
Well, thanks a lot, Tim. I want to actually take up some of the things that some of the previous speakers have already referred to, and that I'm sure future speakers will refer to, which is that when we think about speed in Europe today, I think something quite dramatic has happened in our conceptualization of what we should look at. We should really look at socio-economic development, because while we could assume 10 years ago that it is possible for countries to get on the ladder of enlargement and then the process will do the necessary structural reforms almost by itself, it has become very clear in the last few years that if you want to reach the core of Europe, you can even be a member and not be part of the core, but become part of the periphery again due to economic and social weakness. I mean, 10 years ago we had meetings, I remember, at that time chaired by Greek diplomats in Greece with Ivan Vejvoda, thinking about what to do at the Thessaloniki summit. Well, Greece was thinking about taking a big initiative. And the background to this was that at that time, The Economist was publishing this paper about Greece as Prometheus unbound. You know, there was a special survey of Greece. I mean, it was this economic confidence that made Greece able to take initiatives. And how have things changed in 10 years? what we really see today in the Balkans is a very deep crisis of confidence about growth models. We know now that the growth model of the last few years of consumer credit-driven growth, cheap credits, housing booms, increased salaries in the public sector, that while still having extremely high unemployment rates, even at the best years. I mean, Macedonia had 30% unemployment rates when its economy was growing at 4%. This growth model is no longer available. And we also know something that I admit also when we talked 10 years ago about the need for cohesion policies and structural policies in the Balkans, we underestimated. We also know now how weak and limited some of the EU instruments have been in some of the peripheral countries of Europe. So there is a connection between the EU's internal debate and the Balkan debate. I think the EU needs to figure out much better, and this is really the debate about growth versus stability, how it can promote growth, genuine growth and job creation in its own periphery, even in member states. And whether the EU finds good, credible answers to this will be crucial for the Balkans, which is many steps behind even the periphery in the EU. A colleague of mine went to Leskovac recently. You know, we wrote a report on this 5 years ago, a textile town in South Serbia. What we found was that the whole boom of the last 5 years had produced very little change. It's still 40% of the working age population who has a job. It's aging, it's shrinking, and if you look in terms of multi-speed, you know, you might have some AAA countries in Europe on a highway, you have some EU members on a country road, and the road in Leskovac and many other places in the Western Balkans has not been paved yet. And I think that is really the speed we need to look at, because unless this changes, you know, the purely moving up the ladder of steps from being a candidate to opening accession talks is not going to bring these countries real sovereignty and real influence. Now, the EU, on the other hand, must ask itself whether its policy of withholding some of those steps, as it has done for so long in the Balkans, has actually been smart, because what we found in Croatia is that many of the toughest things only happened the moment Croatia actually became a candidate and opened accession talks. This is when the EU's influence is biggest. You know, it started arresting ministers, including former prime ministers, 3 years before accession. It started handing over generals, you know, with the imminence of accession talks on the horizon. It started reforming its public administration as part of a process of EU accession talks. So I think the EU also needs to ask itself, if it wants to see this really deep reform, structural reform, whether its current policy of holding the beginning of the process back and having held it back for many years is all that smart either.
Do you think that possibly, I don't know if you've been following events in Montenegro recently, but it seems it's curious that a couple of weeks before the European Union countries should give a green light to opening accession negotiations, that also there have been high-level convictions of people, politicians, the mayor of Budva, etc., etc. I don't know if you've been following events there. But don't worry. I mean, but let's talk about this multi-speed thing. How do you think that how will this affect the region? And is it possible that we could arrive in 4 years and discover that everything has changed, and that, or do you fear that everything will have changed, and that in the best scenario that the region will have done everything it's supposed to have done, and found that it's now reached somewhere else which it wasn't expecting to reach?
Well, I think if people in Leskovac or people in Korja in Albania or people in Štip in Macedonia see jobs being created, and there are many more jobs 4 years from now than there are now, I don't think they'll complain about the speed of EU integration. What we really face is 30 years of stagnation, with a few good years in between that produced unsustainable growth. If we look at structural change, employment growth, and at the moment in some regions things declining. So I think the key in this debate must be how the Balkans are catching up as societies. Are education levels rising? Is the infrastructure catching up? Are public administrations more capable of carrying out smart sectoral policies? Are researchers producing the kind of work on sectors that produce the kind of incremental debates which have led to success? And I think this is where Europe is very important, because it is not true that all of Europe is in crisis today. Poland is doing well. I still live in Istanbul. You know, Turkey, Western Turkey certainly is booming. 70% of investment, because Dusan raised that point, in Turkey comes from the EU. There is EU investment to be attracted to an economy that is opening up. So I think what we need in the Balkans is, instead of focusing only, I mean, this is well done by the experts in the foreign ministries and in the government, focusing only on how do we get to the next stage of EU accession, and then assuming there'll be a conveyor belt to really have a more thorough debate on growth and public administration and growth policies. What can be copied from Poland and what should be avoided from, I don't know, Portugal and Greece? What can be done to ensure that the Balkans are capable of absorbing structural funds in the future, or pre-accession funds, with better impact than has been the case even in some EU members?
But what you're saying is not a particularly Balkan problem, is it? I mean, it's a problem of half of Europe or more of how to create jobs.
Yes, but I think in the Balkans, in some respects, it's worse. I mean, still today, you know, if you look at the welfare state, the security systems for families, but also if you look at employment, the rates of female or youth unemployment in the Balkans are extremely high and have been high for decades. And I think this is what sets the region apart. I mean, the best years for a city like Leskovac, you know, have been in the mid-70s. You know, the crisis started in 1979. You know, the 80s were a disaster, then came the 90s, and then came some years that looked good in the statistics recently, but the gains have been reversed. So I think what you need is to have a debate in the region how to avoid that the next 30 years will be like the last 30 years.
Mrs. Zarif, I'm beginning to think that having listened to everything that everybody said on the panel, the actual question that we've got here, the crisis of the EU, future of integration, multi-speed Europe, is actually kind of some kind of, for the region, is quite some sort of quasi-theological debate, which may not really have much relevance to real life. And what's really important to real life is creating jobs and keeping societies stable. Am I right?
I do think that the element of the growth and economic development in general, it is related with the Euro-Atlantic processes in the Western Balkans. Because the feeling of the stability within the country, it is a first momentum which is making a better atmosphere for growth, business doing, and so on. I will give just one small moment of the analysis that, like we have been doing for our political reasons. There have been some rallies and some protests which, for example, concerning the business momentum of the small businesses, immediately they showed a decreasing moment. That's the reason that I would say that this process of Euro-Atlantic integration in general has two lines that are important to be followed. The one, it is the moment of the common stability of the region, which gives a better sense of communication and cooperation. We should not definitely forget the fact that still between us and among us are some issues which are opened. And those kind of issues are not the issues of the development and of the growth, but they are very much the issues related with the questions of nation building, with the questions of the identities, with the question of ethnic issues and territorial reorganizations, those kind of the things which definitely are keeping and they need an answer. And theoretically, European Union, when you think a little bit logically, is the best and easier answer to that, because everything, if you start to try to find locally as an answer, is too heavy, too complicated, and not every time it is an answer. That's the reason that I definitely respect very much the approach which has to do with the seeing the element of the development of the growth and everything, but I would like once again to underline that looking our realistic regional realities, I think that it is very basic the moment of the stability as a precondition for any kind of the growth and of the dialogue that we may continue for the future. I definitely agree that we need a lot of strong steps to take, that the upcoming future 30 years not to look like the last 30 years. 20 years ago, I was young graduated student from Pristina University. I was studying in Pristina University because it was not university in Albanian language in Macedonia. Today, I'm standing and representing my country in a way which is speaking for the dynamics, how the region and momentums, ethnic and political momentums can be developed in the region. And there I think that the orientation toward the Europe, it is very meaningful, and for the Balkans has not only the momentum of the growth and economy. I think that the main moment is the moment of the stability, and then normally together with that, the moment of the level of democracies in our societies. Because I think that the level of democracy in our societies, Macedonia, Albania, Serbia, Kosovo, everywhere, it is crucial from now on in order to upgrade this process, which I think it is very important and in which one normally we have to work commonly together.
All right, thank you. I think, Ivan, you wanted to pick
Yeah,
up something. Be brief, because then we're going to open up.
Something that may be obvious but needs to be repeated, that one of the reasons that we do have stability and it's calming down and that we're not on the headlines is because there is this promise of Europe, to put it very simply. Someone said on the first panel, you know, the soft power, this is where soft power of Europe still works. The attraction of the model, as I said earlier, to join the club that has up until today held peace since World War II is extremely attractive. And yes, as our friend from the International Crisis Group said earlier in her question, there are all these unresolved things, but ultimately it's moving. You know, as a non-official and a kind of independent person, I really believe that it's scandalous that Macedonia is not a member of NATO yet, because that is another building block towards the stability of the region. That democratic processes are slow, well, you know, welcome to 101 in political science. I mean, this was never quick. I just come from Northern Ireland, from Belfast. I mean, just remember that the process took 9 years from the Good Friday Agreement in 1998 until the provisional government was formed nine years later. So I think, although we are all impatient, first of all, we who are living in the region, because we would like to live in more orderly societies more quickly, we do have to understand that these processes, with the double difficult legacy of communism, and in our case of the 1990s debacle, weigh heavily on us. I mean, that's what killed Zoran Đinđić, my former boss. And everyone who comes after is treading more carefully, maybe too carefully, and I think the leadership there needs to be exercised in a much more determined way. But, you know, as Carl Bildt said earlier, the world has changed. You know, he used the statistics about how many people there were in the world, how many there were today. I mean, some of us started here with typewriters and telephones that had round dials. Now there's an iPad on Carl Bildt's lap, and he can follow what's happening in the world. You couldn't do that 40 years ago. And what I mean to say by that is not just to kind of show how the world has changed, but to say that the region itself, the societies, as you rightly say, because it is also about the work of society with itself, is to understand that we are living in a completely different world, and that you do need to go beyond navel gazing and supersizing yourself all the time, thinking that you are the center of the world. We need to have a realistic assessment about who we are, not to belittle our dignity, because it is in the end all about your own dignity, but to understand how you find your place under the sun.
Thank you very much. I mean, I can't agree more. I often begin talks when I have to do Balkan talks, especially to students, by reminding them, just talking about how we should look at the world, that the entire population of the Western Balkans is only the same size as that of Shanghai, or Greater Shanghai alone, one Chinese city. Okay, we're going to open this up now. And the first hand I saw, I can see you over there, but the first hand I saw is, I think in general, could everyone introduce themselves? But I will introduce you, Lazar Kekic from The Economist's sister organisation, The Economist Intelligence Unit. It's over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. Thank you for those introductory thoughts. Can I sort of maybe just quickly on a somewhat critical note? I'm not really sure if this panel is coming to grips with the question posed to it, and I guess the same could be said of the previous panel, Multispeed Europe, the wider issues. I mean, Multispeed Europe here is really, if you look at it, euphemism for disintegration. It's not a question of Norway, Turkey, and the rest are core. You know, it's a question of the whole thing falling apart. Now, without wanting to be alarmist, you know, if you just sort of read the daily newspapers,